It is really my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Lawrence Joseph, tonight. Dr. Joseph is research manager at West Marine, a retailer that specializes in boating supplies and is transitioning, as we speak, into a Waterlife outfitter. He is responsible for managing location intelligence for the business and provides leadership relating to store deployment, among other things. Dr. Joseph earned a bachelor's from Kent State University, followed by a master's from the same institution in 2005. And he followed that up with a PhD from Arizona State in geography in 2013. He has worked as a real estate research analyst with PetSmart. His expertise is in business geography and also in GIS science. He's the recipient of an award for being top student in the business geography field in 2010 and currently serves as vice chair of the business geography specialty group at AAG. He maintains, of course, an active research agenda on top of his work at West Marine. His current objective is to empirically analyze the spatiotemporal results of retail location decision-making processes and develop theory on the evolution and life cycle of supply chain networks given their business model. Tonight, Dr. Joseph will discuss his cutting-edge research on site location modeling approaches for mature retailers and share with us how location analytics has helped West Marine transition to a Waterlife outfitter. Speaking of which, I've already alerted him that there are West Marine customers in the audience today. So with that being said, please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Lawrence Joseph.
Thank you for that warm welcome, and good evening, everybody. I'm definitely very honored, humbled to be here. I am going to talk about West Marine, but I'm setting this up as really a two-part discussion. And I am an academic and I am a practitioner. So the first part, I'm going to give you kind of my academic side, which helps set a lot of context for why a company like West Marine is in the position that it's in today, and also let you know what that opportunity is, because there's a lot of foresight to be gained by understanding knowledge. And my big themes I want to focus on are knowledge and tools, and definitely GIS helps support that. But then there's also the decision-making side and the leadership side. And that's really important as well, because even though software can advise us to do a particular action, it's still generally a human decision. And so you have to balance. That's why site location research is really an art and a science. You may hear that often. And it really is, because it's definitely a balancing act. So the structure of retailing. So retailers have what's called a value platform. You might hear it as value proposition, a little bit different definition. But according to Grant Thrall in his book, in 2002, the value platform he defined as individual factors of a business, such as personnel, service, display of goods, as well as situational aspects of store location. So what all that means is there's a retailer, you as a consumer, what do you think of that retailer? And I'm going to steal an example that I heard, but I like it, and that's Starbucks, Dunkin' Donuts, and McDonald's all serve coffee, but they do it in a different way. And so even though you can get the same product, you may have your own personal taste preferences, but you're still getting coffee. It's a caffeine delivery system, all three of them. But there's so much different about those three businesses. And so everything that goes into your mind when you think about what's different between these three, that's what you could associate with the value platform of the business. You as a consumer, what value are you getting from that retailer or that restaurant? We also know that retail is extremely dynamic. So if I were giving this presentation a decade ago and I said Amazon, would we know what Amazon was 10 years ago? I'm not sure exactly when they started. I don't know how long they've been in existence, but just as a general mass of population, 10 years ago, we may not have known them, certainly not 20 years ago. Walmart in 1980 was just a regional chain. In fact, it was still pretty regional in 1990 because who was king of the discount department store space in the 80s? Kmart. And you still have locations with good signage. I see coming in on Interstate 10 from the Ontario airport. There's still some around. Although those centers aren't looking too healthy, but they were king. And so a lot of chains didn't even exist in the 80s. Chains have started up in the early 90s. They've already died. But since the time I've done this research, Borders is gone, Linens and Things is gone, Circuit City is gone. You're seeing consolidation in office supply, where we used to have 3, and then we had a merger with Office Depot and Office Max, and so then we had 2, and now Staples is getting in the mix, so now we're only going to have 1, and so now we're going to see shuttered store locations across the country, and for the longest time, the SEC didn't want Office Max and Office Depot to even merge. They thought 2 was even not enough competition. Now we're faced with a new reality that, yeah, we're probably just going to end up with 1. So retail changes, I think, faster than most other industries. And so you have to have the foresight of what's happening and be prepared rather than be reactionary. We've had increasing customer differentiation. And depending on your time frame that you're looking at, you could say over 50 years, how have consumers changed? Well, certainly household sizes have become much smaller. You can look at moving from first from cities, then exodus to suburbs, now movement back into cities, looking at entering suburbs as now being more blighted than before in different cities. So consumers are changing, consumer needs are changing. That's why lifestyle segmentation is an excellent tool in analysis, and certainly not just for retail. There's the need to satisfy investors with growth, as I talked about. Walmart's greatest increases in stock prices in its history have been related to the times that they've told Wall Street that we're growing stores. And when you tell the market that you're a growth company, the market listens to you. Unfortunately, what happens is the market wants to expect the same level of growth. And when you're a mature company, how is that sustainable to continue that level of growth? So then what we see in a response is a development of store types. So we know that our prototypical Walmart supercenter can't work in all locations, so we need to have some different types. And I show them later with the neighborhood market, let's say. And that's one of Walmart's big growth initiatives, is to do something with a different format of store, because they can be successful in locations that they could not be with the supercenter. And so the big theme is that companies aren't doing this because they want to do it. They're doing it because they have to do it to continue to grow. Because if it was easy, if it was low-hanging fruit, they would just build supercenters. And then there's certainly a lot of outside exogenous factors that affect the structure of retailing. We talked about the recession being one. And so there's, just as a retailer, sometimes there's things not in your control, but you have to account for. But then there's also decision making, which is something that you do control. And that's the thing that you got to be really careful around. And so on this flow chart here, this is the decision making that goes into whether or not to build a store in a particular location. And so we start with a general objective, which is in your top left corner. There we go. And the objective is we want to grow. Most retailers want to grow. Or if you can't grow in the case of, say, a Kmart, they're just trying to sustain their business. Sometimes the objective is to actually shrink the business, although that's generally a different model because that's a store closure model as opposed to a open store model. So why do you want to grow? You want to increase sales as an objective. Sometimes companies are looking at it from a top line perspective. Sometimes they're actually looking at their four-wall cash flow, but generally there's a desire to generate more revenue. It may be to increase your market share, or sometimes you're growing to protect against the competition. And we saw that with the home improvement game especially, and in the US Southeast where Home Depot and Lowe's were just going at it in markets, and sometimes they're trying to block each other or get into intercepting positions. And sometimes as a retailer you're presented with, and this is more from my PetSmart days because West Marine doesn't really have a major national direct brick and mortar competitor today, but sometimes you're told you can have this location and cannibalize your own sales, or you can let Petco take it and they're gonna hit your store. So do you want to lose 25% to yourself, or do you want to lose 25% to them? So sometimes there's objectives just about protecting markets. So in this process, are you a mature company? So has the company reached real estate maturity? And if you have not, then you're going to grow via real estate if you can, because it's a great mechanism to build your revenue as a business if your other stores are profitable. And traditionally, brick and mortar was the main form of immediate retail growth, and you have to identify location types to target for this growth. And what locations do you choose? Well, you want to choose ones that are analogous to locations that you already have that are really successful. So if I'm PetSmart, I'm going to find a location that has a lot of households, has good income, and where there's a lot of single family homes, because I know those customers are going to have dogs. And so when you have affluent individuals that own dogs, they tend to buy premium products which have a higher margin, a higher price point, and subsequently I can have a very, very successful store because I know that's a winning formula. If it's an area where people are having more cats, and cats don't consume as much as dogs, so you spend less on cats. Many times they're in smaller residences, so in urban areas you have a higher percentage of cat ownership because you have people that live in condominiums and apartments, and just the share of wallet that you're going to get from that customer is not as high. So you're going to choose the areas where you can have more penetration of dog food sales and ideally premium sales, and then also services, because you're going to need some grooming on your dog, whereas you wouldn't need it on your cat, and everything that could go into just dog ownership and just how much pet parents spend on their dogs. So I'm going to look for those types of locations, and I'm going to identify potentially suitable sites, which I'm going to use my trade area data, my location data. I'm going to look at different factors. Every business is different. I heard a presentation from Drive Time Insurance that said, we look for incomes below this level, and we look for high rates of divorce, and we look for this and this and this. So for that business model, they have a set of criteria that they've identified that they can be successful with, whereas it's going to be different if you're Ulta. So every company has a different set of criteria. And then you're going to tell your brokers, your real estate team to go find some sites. And when you find those sites, you're going to analyze them. And you're going to say, is this location consistent with my value platform? You want to know the size, the sales, potential margin. So you're going to do your forecasting. And then you're going to see how it affects all of the other stores in your chain. You want to know, obviously, cost, because it's not just about sales, it's about how much it costs as well. And when we talk about West Marine, that's a big aspect, is what are we willing to pay for rent. Also, you're going to see if you're going to get building improvement money from the landlord, and then what are just any other costs associated with this location, things supply chain. So I don't have a store right now in Juneau, Alaska. But if I were to open one, that's going to be really tough to get a district manager up there and to definitely get the store stocked with the inventory in the amount of time our customers deserve it. And then if everything works out, we're going to open that store. And that's going to add to our chain. And so the important thing to understand is every time you make a decision to open a store, that is not an isolated decision. That affects everything else in your business. You can get away with making a bad decision, even a few bad decisions, depending on the size of your chain. But if you're consistently making poor decisions, your chain is going to fail. And then this cycles back because growth, you always need to grow. You can't stop growing. However, at a point, you're going to hit real estate maturity. And how do you know when you're mature? Well, you know because you have to alter your decisions. You can no longer do what's comfortable. Walmart, in 2007, their CEO announced that our preference would be to continue building Walmart supercenters. But they ran out of locations, or locations where they were getting acceptable sales to a level they're comfortable with. Subsequently, they had to find another way to grow. So when you hit real estate maturity, you have to identify other growth strategies. Sometimes you can just try to improve your same store sales, and companies will revitalize their own stores. You can improve your margin. You can put pressure on your vendors and get better prices. You could try to grow more online. You can identify new concepts or things we can do differently. Or you could look, maybe at this point, because this is a domestic perspective, okay, now it's time to seek growth opportunities out of the country. And that's not necessarily always something that works out. So in this evolution of chain networks, as I mentioned, every decision affects your entire chain. So a collection of individual decisions is what creates your chain network. And there's a lot of certainly research that's led to theories on the spatial organization of stores and markets. And we're not going to get too much into some of the other research that's out there, but my research does do some things differently in its treatment of mature chains over time. So I think I've explained this concept pretty good so far. Real estate maturity, every retailer has a point, only a limited number of locations that can be profitable, so there is a threshold. At some point, every time you open a new store, it's just going to hit and ding your existing stores, so you'll hit cannibalization thresholds that are unacceptable, and then that's going to put constraints on organic and familiar growth, and you got to do something different. So let's see this in action a little bit. Target has stores in many different types of locations. They have their traditional locations that are in power centers, usually with a good lineup of other retailers, a lot of parking. There's going to be fairly decent income in the area. And if there's enough households making a certain level of income, they can generally be successful. However, Target, especially in 2007, because PetSmart was following Target a lot into these centers, they were going into the developing areas of suburbs where the population density hadn't arrived yet, and there was projected to be housing growth. That growth never occurred, so there were a lot of Target stores that opened up not meeting the forecast expectations that they would have liked. So what you end up with is situations like this. This is one of my favorites. Can anybody take a guess where this is? It's not within 30 miles from here. That's my only clue. That's Bullhead City, Arizona. And in one of my papers I did on creating a location typology of retail stores. This is what we refer to as retail before rooftops. You always want to have the rooftops, then the retail. So that's what happens. And I think the center is maybe at 60% occupancy, but it's always crickets over there. So what did they do? They went into Chicago. This is South Loop area, and by all accounts opened up a very successful Target store. And that was a little bit of a deviation for them going more urban. But there were criteria in place that allowed that one to be successful. In a conversation earlier today about Target's expansion in Chicago, going into an area, a notorious neighborhood where the Cabrini Green townhomes once stood, which were an urban development housing project, and the area is being gentrified now, and the Target just opened up a store last year on the site of these notorious townhomes, and just watching how their decision making is changing as they're looking for more places to expand. They went into Harlem about 5 years ago, and they introduced a new concept, City Target. There's, I believe, one in LA. I know there's one in San Francisco. This is Miami, where they have a different looking type store. And then they had their Target Greatland. So they did some different things with some concepts. They tried Target Greatland, and then they did Super Target, and so they have different types of stores. Then they decide, let's go to Canada. They went to Canada not because that's what they wanted to do all along and then just decided, oh, we're going to hold off, we'll eventually get there. No, they ran out of opportunities to grow in a familiar way, so they set their sights on Canada. They did major acquisition. Well, what that led to in the rapid speed, we talk about retail being dynamic, it took what, less than 18 months, something like that, to figure out, all right, we didn't plan it right, we didn't do it right. There's a lot of competition with Canadian Tire, with Walmart. We don't have our inventory. We're not giving the Canadian customer the same experience as we're giving the US customer. Canada didn't help them. And they didn't plan it out right. They did it in a hurry. They thought they could open the doors and be successful. And that is retail arrogance. And that's what you see in the business world, in retail especially, is arrogance to think that we can be successful just by opening the doors. And that is not the case. This is cutthroat, Darwinistic business that you need to be smart. So, in this paper that I mentioned was recently published, this is modeling chain expansion and maturity through wave analysis. I use a lot of GIS, definitely, for this paper. And it's theory and applications to Walmart and to Target. So what do we have here? What happened in Roseville, Minnesota? Why do I highlight Roseville, Minnesota? Yeah, that was the very first Target store. And so that then answers my question for why I highlight Rogers, Arkansas. That's the very first Walmart store. Now, who can tell me what year these chains started? And it was both in the same year. And to caveat that question, Target, the business model changed a little bit because it was a smaller store that went through an evolution, but the first actual Target store, 1962, is when they both opened, which is great for doing analysis, especially from a spatiotemporal perspective, because now I can start at the exact same year and really focus on how these two chains grew. So what this is, I'm not going to spend too much time. I want to get to the results. But I took a method from medical geography that studies the spread of disease. And you can think of the spread of retail stores like a disease that's spreading, just not in a negative connotation. I have to say that because I'm a retail guy. But I adapted this method to the study of diffusion patterns of retail stores over time and space, and then in particular Walmart and Target. So what you have with a growth of a retailer, is these are virgin markets. You don't have a store there today. So that's a prospective market. And then you move to a stage where you open up a store in a new market. So when you do that, I call that the swash stage. Just like waves coming onto a beach, think of the water comes up, that's the retail store going into an area. They build their stores, so they're deploying, but then they build all the stores that they want in that area at that time, and then they focus on some other area to grow. So then a period of time goes by where that retailer is not building a store in that area, and so that's this backwash. So here's your water coming back now. So they have stores in an area. Are they done? Well, time goes by, and for a retailer, a growing retailer, they look at an area and they say, where can we put a store? Well, you know what? That San Bernardino store is doing really, really well. So is there anywhere else we can grow? We have customers that are coming 12 miles to shop our store right now. It looks like we're not fully deployed in this area. So let's go build a store in Redlands. And let's have 2 stores, and let's just saturate the area. And that type of deployment then is reswash. So you come back into the area, and you're cannibalizing your own stores. So this is this cannibalization phase. So what a lot of retailers do when they grow is they follow this kind of slope. And you can interpret this as here, they have no stores. Here, they're building stores in an area. This indicates that they're building less stores in the area than they built in a previous time period. So maybe they built 12 in the area to start, and then the next 5 to 10 years they're only building 3. And so because it's less than the preceding period, that's why it dips below this particular line. And that's what the equation I have that I fast forwarded past explains. But then eventually they come back and they say, we could have even more stores. So in that area, let's build 6. 6 is greater than 3, so it goes up beyond that line. Those areas I'm talking about, those are rings around each of the stores. So what I did is I built a time-space matrix to count over time each one of these rings, which are 200 kilometer in width, each of these going out, how many stores were built in that area from the store within a 5-year time interval going back to 1962. And so for Walmart, this is 0 to 200 kilometers from Rogers, Arkansas. And it progressively goes up in distance as you move away from Arkansas. And this is a count of their store locations within each one of those time and space cells. This thick line indicates what is called the leading edge. So the leading edge says that's the first time that Walmart put a location in that particular area. So in the first area, within the first 5 years, Walmart had 2 stores. Within the second 5 years, so in this case it's 1965 to 1970, they built 4 stores 200 to 400 kilometers away. And what this really shows, your takeaway from this should be that Walmart moved, they radiated out of Arkansas in a very methodical manner. They spread like this. Target didn't grow that way. Now, Target's kind of jumping all over the place here, and who knows why? Early, at least. It's acquisitions. They had acquired Fedco, Jim Mart, some other Western chains, and so that gave them a presence in the West Coast, and they've been in California for a very, very long time. So that's why they were able to have stores up to 1,600 kilometers away from Minneapolis area at a very, very early stage. So looking at these two, does that mean Walmart and Target grew differently? Well, at the beginning, But what about this kind of effect? Is that still in play once they're in an area? And I'll go to this slide here, and I'll direct your attention to this being the area closest to the Walmart. So the rings, these are double rings, 0 to 400 kilometers, and that's denoted here. So they ramped up their deployment. They were focusing on other areas for a long time, but then eventually they had to build more stores close to home. So in Walmart, they were replacing supercenters or standard stores with supercenters. And so in some cases, they were able to have a bigger store within the market, but then they even had to come back and look at doing a second store. So maybe they had 2 in Fayetteville, North Carolina. Well, now they need a third. And so after 2000, that's what you started to see. And what's really interesting is because you saw that stepwise process, that every single aerial unit in a sequential manner exhibited this kind of activity. But the focus is then what happens once you have already cannibalized your stores? What happens the second time around? Now Target, even though they grew, they have had most of their store growth after 1980, but they too show this kind of pattern. So Walmart, as we talked about, they decided to keep growing. We're going to have some new formats. The sites, the trade areas are different today than they were back in 1998. And the reason why I focus on 1998 is that's when the first neighborhood market opened. But they're going into different real estate than they were familiar with as they were growing an abundance of stores. Here's what the chain looked like with its store deployment in 1998. This is a spatial mean center, so just the average of all their locations domestically, not including Alaska and Hawaii. And then that's their deployment in 2014. So you can see especially the urban Northeast megalopolis, how dense that gets. It means Walmart's going into denser urban areas. And I know I said I'd skip past this one, but I just want to show you one thing here. Walmart stores in 1998, the average population density, and this is every store in their domestic chain, was about 1,000. That's gone up to 1,300 in terms of population within the population density within their trade area, meaning they're going into more and more urban areas. Now, here's the deployment of Walmart Neighborhood Market, their new concept. And we saw from the space-time matrix that Walmart radiated out of Arkansas. Well, they're not radiating out of Arkansas here. In fact, their spatial mean center is in Oklahoma. That's because here in the Southern California and Southwest areas, we're familiar with Walmart Neighborhood Market. It's been around for a few years. But what they're doing here is they're taking a metro area and they're building 30 to 40 stores within a 2 to 3 year period and just going metro area by metro area, which means if you're Chicago and you have one of these and you're a grocer in Chicago, you better be on the lookout. You better have the foresight, not just to know about your business, but to know what the competition is doing too. And certainly the Northeast, they have very limited presence. And this map now is a little bit dated. So I'm sure that, I know that they said to Wall Street they're going to grow the neighborhood market as a main component of their store growth. So I'm sure there's a lot more dots on that than today.